To be with us as we discuss Ecclesiastes and the wisdom of Solomon and just experiences and what we can glean from that. Thank you for everyone here, both physically and virtually, and ask you to be with their families, and God bless them all. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 4 through 8. And you can see from the title, success versus satisfaction. You can see success is in air quotes, right? So we're going to talk about that. What is success in relation to satisfaction? So Solomon says in chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, "And I saw that all labor and all achievement springs from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hands and ruins himself. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Again I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For who am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business." So we know that Solomon was, at his time, the most successful person around in the world. You think of the positions and roles he played. He was king of all of the known world at the time, of the most preeminent civilization at the time, Israel. He was CEO, he was COO, and he had everything at his disposal, all the wealth and power. It's hard to compare someone these days to Solomon. Someone may be wealthy, someone may be powerful, they may be a well-known politician or celebrity, they may have a lot of money, but they don't have unilateral authority over everybody and everything. Solomon did. So we can read his words and say he had a different perspective later in life. He achieved everything based on wisdom that God gave him. And he looked retrospectively towards the later end of his life, and he wrote Ecclesiastes, and he had some knowledge based on his own history, some of his own failures. Now, he didn't have it easily. It wasn't just given to him, and he had it for the rest of his life. As happens in that civilization even today, people of power are constantly fighting off their rivals. And Solomon was too. One commentator said if anybody knew about a rat race, it was Solomon. He was constantly chasing after everything he wanted. So when Solomon talks about success, which was in quotes, perhaps we should listen. That is the motivating factor that Solomon had that we can see in our world today, epochs later, is what are we chasing after? And a lot of people are chasing after success, and that's what motivates them. In school, in their career, on the athletic field, their music performance or movie set, they're chasing after that carrot. They want that success. Now, we're going to balance that. We're not going to say, and Solomon never said, success is bad. We're not going to say competition is bad, because Solomon didn't say that. We're going to try to balance that and look at that when we say success versus satisfaction. Commentaries say we're told to dress for success, drive for success, obtain the symbols of status of success, and be willing to sacrifice anything and everything to achieve success. When you look at Solomon's life, and later on when he wrote Ecclesiastes, he thought to himself and chose to write under God's hand that he did that. He sacrificed everything for success. And what did it leave him? You read in there what we just read, that he said, vanity and striving after wind. It's when you singularly pursue success like he did. Now, as I said earlier, he didn't condemn success, and he surely didn't encourage complacency, or lethargy is another word for that, in regards to making a living, because he did say, if you look in verse 5, he denounced the fool who folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. In other words, the person that doesn't do anything. Opposite end of the spectrum. He pursued success, but he also condemned those who chose not to do anything. He said they just folded their hand. So that's where the conflict is. That's where the tension is. Trying to find that middle point between all that pursuit of success versus doing nothing. And that's where the wisdom of Solomon comes into play. He does not question success. What he questions are the motives of achieving success, because that is what he lived through. Okay, next slide, please. I've got assistants up there, and I appreciate it. Y'all are awesome. The faulty motives for success. The first one being competitiveness. When you look at verse 4 of chapter 4, Solomon says, "And I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is a result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor." And this is where he couches it in the phrase, vanity and striving after wind. Commentators say this is kind of an overstatement. He's trying to make a point for dramatic intent. Another word for that is hyperbole. Okay, he kind of went out there on a limb to say something to make a point. Is that this is vanity? It just doesn't go anywhere. You might as well be chasing the wind, which is you can't do that. He says that when you look at some of the motives for competition, that being envy and competitiveness, sometimes if that drives people for all-out success, then that is for naught. You don't gain a lot for that. Now, I put it and couch it in terms that we can relate to, is that he was not a capitalist. It was definitely not a free market system that we have today. I'll raise my hand and say I am a huge cheerleader for free market capitalism. Economics is a kind of a hobby. I studied it, and I think capitalism is the best system we have. And that's where Solomon would probably say the same thing. But what are the motives for that free market system and that capitalist society that we have? Because we see that imbued in everything that we have, right? Entrepreneurs that I deal with, they're capitalists, and they are all about competition, and they need to be, right? We see it on the athletic field. We saw it yesterday. Very competitive. We see it even in people who are in the performing arts. They're trying to be the best they can be. We see it in different kinds of sports. We see it in our jobs, in our professions. Definitely in mine. Extremely competitive. But that is what we do to achieve success. And Solomon is saying, what are you doing it for? What are the motives? Commentators said the compulsion to outdo someone else, competition can be good and healthy. But if you're just trying to outdo someone for the mere sake of outdoing someone, then perhaps we need to look in the mirror a little bit. He says that our cultural mindset is very competitive, and we read that, as Christians, we just need to be sure what our purpose is. Okay? Competition is good. Free market system is good. Solomon wouldn't want that. He preferred his authoritarianism. He wanted to be the boss. He wanted to set the rules. Everyone sets the rules in our system. But what is our purpose? To be number one, to be the best, that's okay. But what are we doing it for? What is our purpose? What is our intent? Commentary I read said, we're told not to be content with keeping up with the Joneses. We're supposed to beat the Joneses, to show them up. So how do we reconcile that? When we achieve purposes that are for good intent, for competition, how do we reconcile that with the success and our own faith? We have to remember what Christ said. He said, "Blessed are the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers," and without exception, without a doubt, to love our neighbors as ourselves. How do we do that? How do we go all out? How do we go in on Monday mornings and try to get that big deal? How to try to beat our competition? Those who play athletics, when they line up against someone on the other side, how do you love your neighbor when you're trying to beat them, to score the points? That's a reconciliation. That's the balance that Solomon was looking at. Someone said, competition with our neighbor is not wrong, as long as we can do it and still love our neighbor. Otherwise, as Solomon said, it's like striving after the wind. Look at greed. Ecclesiastes 4, 7 through 8. Solomon describes a person who's motivated not so much by envy and rivalry as by a desire, commentators said insatiable desire, to have more. His eyes were not satisfied with riches. He needed more. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with wanting more? Okay. She said if that's your focus, if that's all you're doing, then that's where it can get wrong. The other part of that is that if that's your primary motive, then wanting more will never be enough. That's the definition of insatiable, right? You ever been so hungry that you just, I can't get enough to eat? Perhaps last weekend, where you just feel insatiable. You cannot whet your appetite. You're just so hungry. And that's what Solomon's talking about, is that can happen with this competitive nature and wanting more and more and more, if that is a singular purpose. That psychologically, the way we're built, once we achieve that, are we done? Solomon said no. We always want more. Okay? If we get the big house, is that enough? We get that first $1 million, is that enough? Where does it end? Solomon, who had everything, right? Was that enough? All through Ecclesiastes, he said, I never had enough. I always wanted more. And we can scratch our heads and say, Solomon, what more do you want? You've got everything, including wisdom that no one else has. And he said, it's not enough. Somehow we have to separate ourselves from the idea that to achieve success, that translates into happiness. And when you look at Luke 12, 13 through 15, we see there that this is the parable of the rich fool. And Jesus was approached by a man who said, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. And Jesus told him, Man, you appointed me a judge or arbiter over you. Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions? When one has an abundance, does his life consist of his possessions? That's a warning, right? We've all seen the memes and heard the things about you never see a U-Haul being pulled by a hearse, right? We all leave it here. So why do we do it? Is success good? Why do we do it? How do we reconcile that? Commentary says the problem with the more is better idea is not the abundance. That's fine. They say it's the delusion that it brings happiness. It's not the abundance. It's deluding ourselves into thinking the more is better, I'll be happy. And I think we can see that in society. Solomon saw it. Here we are multiple generations later, and we can look around and go, yeah, success is fine. But translating that success into tangible assets and material possessions, thinking that that is going to bring us happiness, it'll help. But singularly, just acquiring more and more and more, it gets back to that thought that Solomon had about insatiable desire. And finally, Philippians 4:11-13, which ends with one of my favorite verses, probably yours, one of the most popular. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Paul went through a lot, didn't he? He went from the very highs to the very lows. And that statement at the very end, I can do all things through Him that strengthens me. I can get through everything. Whenever I had success, whenever Paul had success, he acknowledged it, gave glory to God. When he was in prison, he gave glory to God. All right, next slide, please. Purposelessness. That's a mouthful. What does that mean? Break it down, purposeless. Not having a purpose, right? Do we know people who just kind of wander around through life, really not motivated, maybe perhaps because they just don't have a purpose? They don't know what their purpose on life is. It's sad. They are, yes. Brother Charles said many of them depressed, and he would know from his profession, being a psychologist. You probably see it, right? So even less understandable than the person who strives for success out of envy and rivalry, or they're motivated by greed, is the one who works himself to death and doesn't even know why. So the opposite end is perhaps someone who just works. And if you were to ask them, you sure do work a lot, and you got a lot of success. What are you doing? What's your purpose? Do we know people like that? They're achieving for the sake of achieving. But what is their purpose? Do the end justify the means? Why do we work like we do? Many of us work a lot, long hours. Many of you have in the past, right? And you're enjoying the fruits of your many, many years of labor. But we also know people who do that kind of work long hours all the time. Why are you doing it? What is your purpose? One would say Solomon would use the term workaholic. when he looked at this. When he looked at chapter 4, 7, and 8, that's probably an ancient description where he says, no end to his toil. He is never satisfied with riches. He has no one with whom to share the results of his labor. What is the point? Solomon says there isn't one. Why would he say that? Because he lived it. To gain, to achieve, singularly, Solomon say, I don't know if I really had a purpose in what I was doing. A commentary said, workaholism for the sake of just working, there's an underlying spiritual issue. Okay. How many people do we know? I know people who, man, they're successful. But they're working 6-7 days a week, long hours. Do they see their family a lot? No, they don't. Are they Christians? They say they are. But when's the last time they went to church? I know for a fact, years. Their family goes, and their mindset is, I have to keep working. Solomon says there's a check and balance there we need to be very careful about. All right, the alternative. All that bright and cheery news. There are alternatives. Verse 6. Solomon says maybe this drive for success that he had was not in proper place. One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after wind. In one hand, you've got rest, but then you've got, on the other, you see 2 fistfuls of labor. And again, he uses that phrase, striving after wind, chasing after wind, which we know achieves nothing, right? It says, perhaps we need to tone it down a little bit. Perhaps look at the achievement of balance in our lives, which Solomon didn't have, and he regretted it later and chose to write Ecclesiastes about it. Balance and equilibrium. One handful of rest is better than 2 fistfuls of labor and striving after wind. He achieved everything he wanted and then some, and realized maybe I should have come down a little bit, achieved more balance, looked at the needs of others instead of just work. Balance and equilibrium. And as hard as it may be, Solomon was definitely advocating maybe we need a little bit more balance in people's lives. Maybe instead of striving for everything, every material possession, just bring it down a little bit, rest a little bit. And I know some of us may say, I can't do that. I got to keep going. It's just out there. Solomon would say, why are you doing it? What is your purpose? To have it all and be miserable versus maybe not having as much and be happy. And he said it repeatedly. You can see in Ecclesiastes 2:24, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. Kind of getting back to Philippians, knowing that this is from God. And here's Solomon finally acknowledging that everything I have done, all the work I've achieved, it's from the hand of God. Chapter 3, 12 through 13, he says, I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God to do good in one's lifetime. Yes, be successful, but be good. And then chapter 3, verse 22, and I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. So what do we take away from that? What would Solomon say? People, life is short. We're here for a very short period of time. And he said, if you have something worthwhile that you're doing, if you're blessed with good work, good success, you started a business, you've grown a business, you work in a business that's growing and expanding, and you enjoy that, and you're compensated for that, and from that success, you're helping others. He said, that's a blessing. That is enjoyable work. And we should recognize that, as Solomon says, it is from the hand of God. Versus if we have a choice to do something merely because we will gain material possessions, assets, great wealth, but we hate it, right? We don't enjoy the work. We don't really get along with the people we're around. They don't have the same morals and ethics, perhaps, that we do. We go in every day and we don't like it. Oh, but we get the possessions for it. Some would say, think about that. If you have good work and you enjoy it, then that's a great blessing. Acknowledge that. If you're miserable, which Solomon ended up in many cases, it'd say, think about that. Do you really need to do that? Because life is short. Doing something you despise because it makes you successful materially, is that really going to work out? Satisfaction needs to come from doing our jobs and enjoying it. And someone said, not from meeting someone else's criteria for success. So that is the tension. That is the reconciliation we're striving for. That is the alternative to the competitiveness and the purposelessness that Solomon saw, is that we should value good work and we should help others. That's something Solomon saw later in his life, is that unilateral striving for success. If we achieve success, what do we do with it? What is the purpose? What is the motive for achieving that success? How many others are we helping? And we definitely don't want, and that's what I think Solomon's warning to everyone is that don't be like him. Help as many people as we can, lift others up, share our faith, enjoy the fruits of our labor. I think Solomon would look at our free market system and the competition we have and go, wow, that's different. Not that he would appreciate that, but we can achieve success. We can do great things with that. The conclusion is that the balance, the equilibrium, is peace and contentment. Ecclesiastes 2:26 talks about that. For to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. So we see the kind of the difference there, right? Solomon definitely saw that and pointed it out. For to a person who is good in God's sight, God has given wisdom and knowledge, and the emphasis is, and joy. But to the one who does acknowledge the gifts of God, it's very interesting that Solomon says, that's the sinner, and they have the task of gathering and collecting so that the one who is blessed and acknowledges God and is good in God's sight. I think Solomon would say, which one are we? So what is satisfaction? In that previous slide, the first slide, we had success in quotes. What is satisfaction? What is success? Well, if you look at Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, it's pleasing God. And everything comes into play after that. God's blessings will flow from that. Satisfaction begins with success of living a life that pleases God. That is the equilibrium. That's the balance. That's what Solomon is saying. The conclusion of these verses is that don't be striving after wind. Where is your success coming from? What is your purpose? What is your meaning? God bless you if you're successful. What do you do with that success? Where does it all begin? Living a life that pleases God. After everything Solomon went through, when he wrote Ecclesiastes, what would his definition of success be? It's definitely different than when he started out, right? That wisdom he wanted came into play, and he saw how he had squandered all the success and achievement, everything he had gained. And finally, he said, oh, it's all from God. I understand it now. Success, according to Solomon's words, is serving God and finding enjoyment in life that he has given us. And we see this in the words of Jesus, Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. If we do this, if we follow what Matthew said, if we seek God first, seek his kingdom first, everything falls into place. All these other things will be added to you. I think it's really cool that Solomon had said that a millennia earlier, and Matthew's saying it now with Jesus. Anybody have any thoughts? None? I know it's a weighty subject. So what have y'all seen? What do you see in society? What do you see in your work life, your retirement life? What do you see culturally that's going on? Do you agree with Solomon? Do you see that happening today? Pretty interesting thoughts. All right, that's the first bell. There not being anything further, I think I've said enough. Right. She just emphasized that if anything, we want to have balance in our lives. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.